Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. We know it's super busy, and there's a lot of things going on at the same time. But we want to be cognizant of the time and go ahead and get the program moving, because we have a really tremendous program this morning. And I'm very excited for both listening to the panels as well as participating on them, but largely because these are some very interesting issues, and I hope that you find all of this of value as well. Our two panels will focus on exploring ways to strengthen patient access to rare therapies, both through the FDA approval processes as well as in our most vulnerable communities through the 340B program. We're grateful to our expert speakers for joining us this morning, and we look forward to the discussion. My name is Mike Egame, and I'm the Executive Director of the Rare Access Action Project, or RAAP. Many of you may have heard my own rare story and the loss of my father to a rare cancer. That experience shaped my search for finding solutions for patients, meaningful solutions that can improve patient access to care and therapies. RAAP is a coalition of patient, provider, life sciences, supply chain, and health professional stakeholders. And it always makes me smile when I try to explain who we are, because we have such a broad footprint with so many stakeholders participating at RAAP. What's really fun is that in 2026, this marks our 10th year of operation at RAAP. We started as an ad hoc coalition here in Washington, D.C., in the kind of that great tradition of coalitions, with 5 of us around a conference table, taking notes as we were kind of eating our lunch. All of us were teams of like 1 or 2 people, and we needed to find a way to work together to improve patient access. And so by forming a group together, even at that time, ad hoc, and all of us just trying to find the time to make it move forward to this point, has been a tremendous experience. Since that first meeting around a conference room table, we've grown into an advocacy organization with initiatives at both the state and federal levels, working with patients across 20 states and assembling one of the most talented access teams in the rare community. In fact, as I thank our team for all they do to advance patient access, I would be remiss if I didn't also note that this team, many of them also face rare disease, both in their immediate families as well as their extended families. At this time, I'd like to turn a few minutes over to our newly appointed chair of our advisory board, former Congressman Matt Salmon, for introductory comments. After Congressman Salmon, we'll move directly into our first panel, FDA Reforms for Rare Diseases, Understanding the Current Landscape and Pathways to Move Forward.
I'm thrilled to be the chairman of the Rare Access Action Project. Let me just share with you a little bit about my background. I first came to Congress in 1994 during the Contract with America. And you might remember one of the pieces of legislation, you probably don't, looking at your ages, it's big time history, but one of the bills in the 10 bills of the Contract with America was actually to streamline and make major reform to the FDA, because prescription drugs and modalities and treatments were taking just way too long compared to some of our other countries in this world. And it was very, very frustrating. And I looked at the landscape, 30 some years later, which is where we are today, and not a lot's changed. Still, what is it, about 1 in 10 drugs actually ever makes it through the FDA process. The cost is exorbitant. The length of time is still, I believe, way out of whack with what the healthcare needs of our citizens are. But fast forward, I'm one of the people, I actually term limited myself, and I think there were 100 of us that took a term limit pledge, and there were like 5 of us that actually kept it. And I left in 2001, and I was one of the guys that didn't learn well enough, and I came back 12 years later. Back in 2012, I was reelected and came back. And at that time, I was one of the sponsors of the 21st Century Cures Act. And I was also the founder, if you will. How many of you are familiar with the right to try? I was the very first congressman that ever introduced that at the federal level. Now, it didn't go very well when I first introduced it, even though we had a lot of ALS patients that came and descended on the Hill. We were not ultimately successful while I was here, but the guy that replaced me was a good friend, and I asked him to carry the torch, and he got Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, to carry it. And now it's the law of the land. And it's those same principles that drive me now, because there's 30 million Americans that are dealing with rare diseases. And their access to treatments and drugs is compromised. And I know that a lot of the legislation that policymakers are trying to push is designed to make healthcare, specifically prescription drugs, more affordable, to the masses. But you read in the good book, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so many of these things, like 340B and copay accumulators and coupons, and I'll go on and on. And now the states are doing PDABs. And it's all meant to do really good things. But within that very fragile ecosystem, it's like when you push a bubble, it bubbles out somewhere else. And there are people that end up bearing the brunt of the costs. There's always a cost benefit with everything that we do. And the sad thing is that while some of these things, and recently, MFN and MFP, those things are all designed to make it cost effective and affordable and help people. But a lot of times you're not considering the effect that it has on these 30 million people that need life-saving, treatments and drugs themselves. And it actually really negatively impacts them. And so my hope and desire as, you listen today to the people on the panels is that maybe you learn something new. And as we craft, I think the goals of all of the things that I just talked about, the goals are really noble. They're really good ideas. But please, please, please don't forget about the people that need access to these life-saving treatments and drugs, because their lives really depend on it. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being willing to listen.
So I'd like to welcome our first panel up. FDA reforms for rare diseases, understanding the current landscape and pathways forward. And I'm actually really excited for this panel. Both of our panelists have been friends and colleagues for far too long. And I really appreciate not only their friendship, but their advice, their counsel, as well as their friendship over the years that we've known each other. Nancy Myers is the founder and CEO of Catalyst. Nancy serves as a senior policy counsel. Well, and by way of background, Catalyst is a regulatory FDA company and serves as an advisor, as an expert to help companies navigate the FDA. And Nancy is very active on FDA issues. And I'll just share a little bit of her background. Nancy served as a senior policy counsel in the Office of the FDA Commissioner and as a senior strategic advisor to the FDA Acting Deputy Commissioner for Operations. She's also the chairwoman of the board for the FDA Alumni Association and a founding board member of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. Through Catalyst, she advises clients on complex regulatory pathways, patient engagement, and government relations, with a particular focus on cell and gene therapy, pharmaceuticals, and digital health. So, Nancy, welcome, and thank you for joining us. We also have Paul Kim, who is founder and principal at Kendall Square Strategies. And Paul has been a fixture in the Boston policy area for a number of years. I actually first met him when he was with Senator Kennedy, and I was with Senator Hatch. And
Paul's a goat. Like he's That's right.
No money was paid for these endorsements.
Yeah, exactly, but it is interesting to me that over the years, those relationships that we developed in those bipartisan conversations, on the old Labor and Human Resources Committee, then the Health Committee, carried forward. And Paul now, looking back, has experience in life sciences and public health sectors. He provides strategic advice to Fortune 500 companies, emerging biotech firms, and patient advocates. He advises on FDA product approvals and life science policy. He's previously served as a health policy counsel, as I just noted, for high-profile U.S. legislators, including Senator Kennedy, Congressman Henry Waxman, sorry, I was just speaking too fast, and Senator David Pryor. And of course, over the last 20 years, leading FDA and federal government strategy practices as a partner at Foley Hoag. So welcome, Paul.
Thanks.
And welcome to the panel. At this time, I'd like to turn some time over to our two panelists to talk to us a little bit about their reflections on both the topic and some kind of general understanding of the landscape at the FDA. So with that, I'll turn it over. Nancy, if you would like to kick us off.
Sure, that's great. Can you hear me? So I love the fact that this opened up with talking about contract with America, because that is the one thing that, the one thing you realize when you've been in DC for a long time is there's a constant pendulum that swings. And we focus on different things at different times, and then we pull it back because we get too extreme and we move back. And so with contract, there have been a number of times when people have looked at the FDA and said, yes, we've got to get patients their medicines faster, better, safer, all of those things. And it's just how that current administration approaches that problem with which solutions. So I remember during that time, that was when I was just starting on the Hill. And I was working for a Republican member at the time, Elk McMillan from Charlotte, North Carolina. So I think for those that are watching FDA right now, FDA has gone through it's been a very big swing in the last year and a half. When you think about a strong FDA, you really want something where, especially in the rare disease space, you want an agency that's safeguarding the public health, but also enables access to innovation. And so that's a little bit of a balance that goes back and forth. And you want what industry wants and what a lot of patients want is an FDA that's predictable, so that you could, one that's reducing regulatory uncertainties, one that's speeding access and reviewing and approvals, and also one that puts in place policies and procedures that ensure patient-focused innovation and that we're a global leader. So those are all, I think, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, whether you're in between, that's what everybody wants. But the current environment, though we have an administration that really has some fine intent to speed things up, to focus on rare disease. If you talk to a lot of the industry right now, there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of uncertainty being created by a new approach to how to regulate. And so one of the things that I thought I'd focus on that my clients have really been challenged with is what is the FDA saying and what is the FDA doing? And the key part of this, if you don't take anything away except for one thing, is that if you're a rare disease advocate or if you're a staffer on the Hill, what you want to do is if they say it, make sure they do it. And so it's really holding people's feet to the fire that the actions are what really are going to drive change over time. And so when I think in the last year and a half, you've had the biggest change at FDA, I would say, is that the staffing has changed. When they came in and did the reduction in forces, that was a major blow to the agency. You had CDER, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. That's the drug center. CDER is down 20% on its staff from January 2025. So that was all last year and into this year. But now the commissioner is very focused on rebuilding the agency and trying to add new expertise back. The challenge for this is that in Q2 of this year, they added 58 new staff in Cedar because they're trying to build it back, but 77 people left. So what's happening is that as the commissioner tries to rebuild the agency, there are a lot of expertise that still continues to leave the agency. And that's when you're a rare disease advocate, you want the top people to be reviewing those products because rare disease is so complicated that it's usually those high technologies, the cell and gene therapies. It's these complicated technologies that you need someone who really understands the regulatory framework, but also understands the science to be able to approve something. So CBER is the Center for Biologics, and they always have longer names, but I'll just call it CBER. But CBER is down 22% since January 2025. In the first 2 quarters of 2026, they added 18 staff, but they've lost 30. So as they're trying to build up, there are still people leaving the agency, and that is because FDA, I do a lot with FDA. When you're reading my bio, everything, it sounds like the only thing I know how to spell is FDA. But with you really need to have these talented people, and they're really, with the reduction in forces and the way it was done, the morale at the agency is very low. And that is, you think, do you love to go to your job? Have your friends left? Those kind of, are you listened to? Do you have a really good manager? If you don't have all those things and you have an incredible skill set, you're not getting paid that much because you work for the federal government. There are lots of opportunities out there. So I just think that's one of the key things to talk about. Even the oncology area of FDA, which always was kind of OCE is the special place for cancer drugs because we really need cancer drugs. 40% of those people have left over the last year and a half. So, and those, as if you listen to former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, a lot of the people that left were the ones that were the most experienced. And so that's not good. But anyway, so the other thing that you really want from FDA is you want this predictability. And you have predictability when you actually write things down in a way that people understand. And that's through guidance. And it sounds so nerdy that, somebody would ask for guidance and let's go through an APA process where you have to get notice and comment. It's so slow. But the reason why industry and patient advocacies tend to like guidance is that if you stick to what they say, then your reviewers, you can point to it during a review and say, I followed that stuff. And if you don't have that, if it's just published in JAMA, or it's just published somewhere, or someone is on a stage saying, this now applies to everybody, when you go in as a company, you can't really point to, oh, here's a quote from somebody who came in who may be gone in a year and a half or 2 years. So that's
on TikTok.
Yeah, I really do. So anyway, back to my bottom line, and then I'll turn it over to the goat next to me. So I really think that it's looking at FDA and looking at what they say and what they do. And be careful with AI, because AI cannot screen AI will report back to you that FDA is doing something if the commissioner says that it's been done. But a lot of times it hasn't been done. It's an aspirational statement rather than something that's really has happened. So if the commissioner says, I believe in radical transparency, he's done a lot on that, in that they're now publishing CRL letters, which are your complete response letters, which is the reason why FDA isn't approving your drug. So those are coming out, so that looks very transparent. And the challenge with that is now it's a document that's for the public rather than to instruct the company on why it wasn't approved, so that they can come back, fix it and come back. But you also, and they've talked about publishing things in clinicaltrials.gov, but that transparency is missing when you look at the agency. So I've been doing FDA work for 20 plus years. I've run my consulting business. I can't even find out who's in what position. The organizational charts haven't been updated. They're a year old, and with this incredible shift of people leaving, I already laid that out. If 20% of the people left and everybody's gotten a new job and they've moved from one center to the other or to the commissioner's office and back, you don't know who to call. They've even removed phone numbers from the DHHS staff directory type stuff. So it's very opaque, even when you're dealing with the agency. But that's, I think, they also aren't holding their advisory committees and things like that. But the last thing I'll say is that the key, when you're thinking about what's being said in the rare disease space and what's being done, the agency is saying, we love rare disease. We want to do a lot of activities. And Paul, I'm sure will talk about the plausible mechanism initiative that they've been doing. But you really have to look at what are they doing to the companies when they're reviewing it. And when I talked about those CRLs, which are the reasons why they're not approving a drug, there had more CRLs in 2025 than we've ever had. They had CDER issued 19. There were at least 23 that happened last year. The highest before that was something like 10 the year before, 9 or the day before. That many of those were accelerated approval initiatives, which that's a pathway that you get if you're a really cool rare disease drug and you don't have a lot of patients and you need surrogate endpoints. You've got 5 of those CRLs were orphan drug CRLs in 2025, and neurology and gene therapies really had a bulk of those things. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, but those are the numbers that you have to be looking at.
Yeah, I think, Nancy, you've given a really clear picture of this normative expectation that the agency could be predictable and flexible. And so sponsors, the patients could understand what they were going to be expected to be asked by the agency in terms of what a pivotal trial should look like, what the trial design, how many patients. And that got turned on its head in the past 14 months. I mean, it's literally a night and day picture. And I don't mean to be grossly overdramatic, but, Congressman Salmon and others spent decades building a regulatory regime at the FDA, supported by federal funding at NIH, all this wonderful consortia and research and R01s that pushed the drug discovery enterprise in the US to the very top of the peak. And when we started working here in DC, it was the exact opposite. New drugs were approved first in Europe or in Japan. So that was what we called the drug gap. I mean, it's a term that's lost favor or use because it doesn't exist anymore. And we flipped the script. Like this year and last year, we should expect about 50 new molecular entities, which are literally new under the sun drugs, never been seen before. It came out of human creativity and this enormously complex and expensive enterprise of drug development. And we get them first here in the US before anybody else. That's the product of bipartisanship, consistent funding from Congress over 30 years. And I'll just call out 2 laws. Orphan Drug Act of '83, which is now over 40 years old. Oh my God. And then PDUFA, which is going to be reauthorized.
Right?
I know, no, I was in high school. And PDUFA, the User Fee Act, which gave user fee revenue into the agency in exchange for performance goals. So again, consistency, predictability, and knowledge. And the agency's been hitting those goals for 90% performance, which is better than I ever scored in college. Year after year after year, decade after decade, cycle of reauthorization after cycle of reauthorization. We're now in PDUFA 8. So, and I was there for the first 3, including the 92 Act, and then subsequently lobbying. So I hope I was doing good in the other ones. I hope we were doing good with the other ones. But, when we look at that process of reauthorization, there was timely, consistent reauthorization. They happened on time. We didn't leave the agency waiting, wondering if they were going to get funded fully. So with that as the background, right, this normal construct of a wonderfully well-oiled engine of innovation on the regulatory side, not just on the scientific and drug discovery side, that script got flipped last year. Nancy's talked about these rifts. That was muscle, not fat. These were people who were absolutely integral to the review staff. The claims are that no reviewers were fired. But I guarantee you, clinicians, consumer safety officers, other people who are integral to the drug review process are no longer there. And so that just attenuates not only the ability of the agency to do the stuff on time, the way they're supposed to under law with the dollars that sponsors give them, but also public-private partnerships. all the other research and engagement with patient groups, listening exercises, stuff that the Congress is so good at telling them to do on top of what they're doing already with the same level of resourcing. That ability and that muscle goes away. And also because of the loss of the senior careers, literally centuries of experience managing drug safety and approving new drugs, that is an irrevocable loss. You can hire 100 new scientists today and restaff the agency, and you're never going to get that experience back. People are going to have to be reading the black letter to understand what they're supposed to be doing for their job versus people who had the muscle memory. Remember when they, going back, old gray hair is not a bad thing when you're at a regulatory agency, and that was
It's not a good thing.
it's not a great thing, but yeah, because there's sort of a level of inflexibility. So so that's what happened in the past year, and I think it's really incumbent on the Congress to do the two things that you guys do. One is make sure that PDUFA reauthorization is done timely. We're talking Q3 of next year. Please get that done on time so that we continue to fund stuff that industry and agency and stakeholders like patients agree to do. And the second thing is you've got to do oversight. I think holding folks accountable for the decision being made. And let me just dive for a moment into those CRLs that Nancy's mentioning. The thing you want to get at the agency is an approval letter, right? You can go to market, you can sell the drug, patients have access. The CRLs are the exact opposite. It is a terminus point where you've been on this wonderful journey of discovery and you end up in the gutter. It's the thing you don't want. And so many CRLs have literally ended drug discovery programs and taken promising new molecules and put them into the trash bin and ended whole companies, right? Just terminated them. That is an irrevocable loss for the US, not only in terms of health and new discoveries and new medicines, but also competitiveness, right? We do see an ascendant People's Republic. They are doing incredible things in life sciences. There are 4 universities I can count that are now top ranked, top 20 universities that weren't there 10 years ago. And the amount of work that they're doing and the funding they're getting from the party, right, and from investors, we're seeing the exact opposite. We're litigating against universities that are in partnership with our sponsored companies. That's why our clinical research is done in the U.S. Those are extremely difficult countercurrents to navigate if you're a sponsor group or if you're serving a patient group trying to get a new drug to market. So those two things, oversight I think is really critical, and holding members accountable. And just about those CRLs, it's easy to personalize it about Dr. Prasad, who is the outgoing director of CBER, Center for Biologics. He did have a personal philosophy that evidentiary standards had slipped, that the agency was approving too many drugs on accelerated approval without asking for the right robust data. Now, that's a personal philosophy. I respect it. It's, I think, a heterodox point of view. I don't think it was really the consensus point of view. But what he did in implementing his views was by basically issuing these complete response letters to companies that had gotten agreement from the agency years before to undertake certain kinds of trials designed in a certain way. And then we're told, once they presented the data, that that was not good enough. That kind of whiplash is toxic to life sciences. You can imagine just anybody being told X, you need X, you bring in X, and no, it's an X prime or it's Y. We just can't sustain a life science enterprise with that kind of whiplash. And I think it may change, he is leaving, but that's what the great and ripe subject matter for oversight, to keep a steady eye on what the decisions are being made at the agency. So I encourage you to do that as well as legislator.
Wow, that was a really pretty thorough dive into some of the issues. And
You can have nerds because
it's wonderful.
We have footnotes.
Because, it's occurring at a nexus of time when there's far more scrutiny on labels. There's far more scrutiny on the science. There's far more scrutiny on, is there real value with the therapy? And once that FDA approval occurs, people are now looking back into the regulatory, both the pathway, the science, how the drug got to where it is now. And what we're finding is, that there is more and more importance placed in the kind of access side now, in the commercial and payer space on what went before it. So my question is, a lot of times we'll hear, from especially our emerging companies and our smaller companies that we work with, is that, when's the right time to start thinking about access issues? How is someone going to utilize the product? Where's it going to be accessible? What is the right way to approach that now, given all of the complexities that you both have described, and knowing that you have to have something that can get to the patient at the other end?
Can I raise my hand on this one?
Yes.
So I would say, I hate to say the number, but let's put it in decades. 3 decades ago, I was working for the Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association as a lobbyist, so that's the health insurers. And I went to the biotechnology, it was the industry organization at the time, and I said, listen, one of the things, all your new biotech stuff, it's a lot of hope, but if you haven't thought about how you're gonna get it paid for, you're just gonna get an approval and then stop. People won't get access to it. So I went over and I was their first reimbursement counsel on trying to get FDA, don't just think about FDA, think about how to get on the market. But over the last several years, that's kind of, everybody did it. We actually made a rip and tear book for little biotech companies that didn't know how to do it, saying, here are the questions you need to ask on access before you go into the clinic. Well, right now, that's one of the biggest changes in access is that you now need the patient voice in all that conversation. You need that patient voice. You can't wait until you've gotten approval and then call the patients and say, hey, can you help me get access for this? You need to have that in early. And so that I think is some of the critical things. But going back to the FDA piece of it, if there's a strong FDA and people know there are consistent standards and good scientists who are looking at it and the reviews are very robust, then the states and everybody else can't second guess that, or it's harder for them to second guess. But if people think that someone is monkeying around with the science or the standards are not consistent, if you see sunlight, then that's when people try to go and exploit it. And that's where, when you have some of the programs that are being talked about, like the commissioner's priority, the national, there's a new voucher program that the commissioner is driving that has price even as part of one of the reasons you could get one of these vouchers. And FDA doesn't do price. So there's just certain things that you really have to look at. And, that's where getting back to FDA needs to be flexible and it needs to really focus on where the science is because the science has progressed. But anyway, back to you.
I think that's really well said. And the focal point, I think, for a lot of this interface between what happens after marketing, once FDA approves a drug, a rare disease drug. Remember, for these monogenomic diseases, a lot of these drugs are the only available therapy. So there should be no barrier, really theoretically, to getting access to that if your kid has that disease and there's one drug that works for it. I don't know why you're jumping through any hoops. There should be basically, a slip and slide to getting access. And so when some of the payers are creating new policies that say, these rare disease drugs, these orphan drugs are being approved under expedited review pathways. So accelerated approval, breakthrough, fast track, priority review. These are ones under what we call Section 506 of the FDC, Federal Food Drug Administration Act. That's where we put the special programs. And these are ones most responsive to the diseases with the most unmet medical need, right? So very important, but we are flexible. Those are inherently flexible pathways. Now the payers are saying, okay, if you got an approval under one of these flexible pathways, it's not really through FDA approval. There's an asterisk next to the FDA approval. So we're gonna look at that, we're gonna scrutinize it. We might throw up more barriers. We might get you to jump through additional hoops. And the hoops are premised on the fact that the approval is not really an approval. If you look at the black letter law and you look at 30, 40 years of agency practice, those 506 pathways that came out of the HIV epidemic, responding to cancer, to warrant cancer, these pathways are legit. They are FDA approvals. There's no asterisks, there's no second guessing, there's no brackets around the thing. So when the payers start putting more hurdles up, what they're saying essentially is we're second guessing FDA approval. We are substituting our clinical judgment for what the FDA reviewers have said about whether the drug is safe and effective for these patients. That should not stand. You all should be looking at that very carefully and asking very tough questions of those payers, because really the only ones who really know that drug and its data really, really well are going to be the sponsor who ran the trials, the principal investigators who ran them, the agency who reviewed the damn thing, and then subsequently the clinicians who are going to be, prescribing on that labeling, right? So, you have to be really vigilant about these barriers. they're in the states, they're at the private payers, they may not be at CMS, although I did say they're repealing breakthrough device, I heard that this today. So, you gotta be looking at these conducts and then look carefully at the writing on the underneath of the policy, because the premises for which they make these policies are very, very questionable. I said too much.
No, no, it's something I think is so important, and, as we work with a lot of patients, and as I had mentioned at the beginning, a lot of rare disease families will work through nonprofits, they'll work through their own companies. John Crowley at Bio is like the biggest name in a father who had rare disease in his children and didn't know what to do, and formed a company, and actually now his daughter has treatment. So the families get involved and are driving these technologies and driving these molecules. And, when we look at the access environment on the other side of this magical FDA approval, no one's thought about it. And so a lot of the things that you talked about, for example, when you go to a Medicaid P&T committee, and members of the P&T committee are sitting around the table going, oh, that was an accelerated approval. It's experimental. Do we have to cover it? Those are the types of conversations that go on. And so understanding that, and then, working to have the certainty, have the clarity, and, the confidence in the FDA approval pathways is critical to making sure the patient has access on the other side. So I think this was an extremely focused discussion on that. I did have another question that kind of dovetails into that. We talked about patient participation. And, since Cures 1.0 and then 2.0, embedding patients earlier and earlier into the development program has led to an increasing phenomenon that we haven't seen since the early HIV days, where we have a generation of well-educated advocates. And when we talk about that pool of people who understand the product or the therapy or the technology, sometimes it's the patient that is kind of standing there at the same level as the clinicians or the company or even the FDA. They've been with the product sometimes since discovery. They've helped create the natural histories. They've, helped enroll in the clinical trials. They've met with your clinicians because those are their doctors, because there's sometimes maybe 1, 2, 3 specialists in the United States. So I guess my next question is, we've been looking at things like the Scientific Expert Act and other ways that we can continue to enhance that. What are some recommendations that you would have to strengthen, that kind of relationship, that dialogue between patients, but more importantly, help it become useful so that when that patient participation provides information on the approval side, that it really has that kind of clarity of thought and can be utilized by a Medicaid program or a payer that's now evaluating if they should be covering that rare medicine.
Drug development is so much richer now than it was 30 years ago. And the tip of the hat to the congressman, because the Cures Act was the first one to really enshrine patient-focused drug development, PFDD, which is a good take-home term, to really make the agency and sponsors acknowledge that patient voice, patient-related outcomes, these were really important and should actually be foundational to what we look at, what we expect to prove when we get drugs approved. And I think that is it's a highway. We can keep building on what has been done in statute and by the agency and programs. And I think requiring or actually encouraging the agency, again with recipient resourcing, to do more is absolutely fabulous. The problem with the drug review process is it's a bilateral conversation, right? Sponsor X with NDA and the agency reviewing, and it's a commercial confidential trade secret conversation. Nobody really surfaces that unless the sponsor actually says, hey, I've submitted an NDA. We wouldn't know that otherwise. So
Right.
In that sort of secret chamber, in that bubble of silence, it's very hard to have stakeholders like patients, especially patients, have their views known. So it's really before submission and then after submission, during review, during advisory committees, that patients are really principally heard. And I think any other initiative to build that process of having patients heard during the process of development and review would be a good thing. Granted, with more resources, accountability and transparency, right? And making sure it's additive, not subtractive of what's already going on. It's absolutely a good thing.
Well, and sometimes I think people drop in legislation because an activity is not happening. I would say that as the FDA signals that they want patients at all those meetings, you know, companies have dozens of meetings leading to their actually applying for an approval. If FDA indicates we want to see more patients at those meetings, the sponsors will have more patients at those meetings. I can see it already with all of my clients. They hardly ever go into an FDA meeting without a patient voice in the room, because they know that when you look at benefit risk on, you know, everything has risks. Every drug that you take has a risk. But what is that? The benefit can outweigh that risk. And so if you have a patient in the room, FDA can ask those questions. So there are parts of the application that actually put the patient voice in the application. Those PFT, you know, those patient-focused drug development meetings are really critical, but FDA has to have resources to be able to do it, and they have to have the staff to actually do that. And that's been one of the challenges. A lot of those people got laid off. So I do think that patient voice has gotten much more important. But then on the flip side, you have to have an agency that will accept real world evidence and really accept what the patient voice is saying. And sometimes the agency says, yeah, we love real world evidence. That's super duper. And then sometimes they say, well, yeah, that's some data. We'll kind of look at it and then, you know, if you have everything else, then we'll kind of look at it, you know, in addition. So I think that's where I think everybody recognizes that it all comes down to the patient. They're not going to take the med if it isn't patient friendly. And so I think it's important.
Terrific. You know, we're going to be running out of time pretty quickly, but I did want to get really quickly, if we could, to you know, some of the initiatives inside FDA to really start focusing on rare diseases and how those mechanisms could be both implemented, but then how can we build a certainty around those? Again, knowing that we're going to have access discussions on the other end of an approval. And one of those, of course, Paul, we talked a little bit about was plausible mechanism. Right. And, you know, particularly, you know, as we look at smaller disease populations, I've worked with patient communities sometimes where there's less than 50 in the United States. And, you know, running a traditional clinical trial is not only prohibitive, but it's also unethical potentially because of the disease progression, the type of way that it acts in the body, those sorts of things. So could you talk to us a little bit about some of those areas that FDA could move forward on and why that would make an impact to patients?
Yeah, the authorities that we talked about in section 506 of the FFDCA, yeah, boy, very loyally, sorry about that, guys. Statutory citation. Fast track, accelerated approval, breakthrough. These are all really good flexible authorities the agency's used for rare disease drugs. And they have very frequently asked for just one, not two clinical trials with confirmatory evidence, which we put into the law in '97. So that's great. But added to that is the plausible mechanism framework. It's an evidentiary framework. It's Dr. McCarry-Prasad, who published last year, and there's guidance, and there'll be more guidance, I think, explaining this, targeting very rare or ultra rare or N of 1, very, very small patient population. And so this is additive to what they used to do. I think it's helpful. It sort of envisions that there's a platform approach that you take one patient here, you take another patient there, you take a patient way over here, and you combine the data in sort of a platform style. You eventually get to data sufficient to approve the drug. A lot of the details have to be worked out, but they're acknowledging that the science has moved to a place, and the example, of course, is BBKJ, right, where you will have a platform or means of producing individualized therapy, curative therapy for genomic disorders that have patients in less than 100 patients in the US, for example. And you could have, I think David Liu has said he wants to see thousands of cures by 2035. That is feasible. That is absolutely feasible. So the plausible mechanism framework is very helpful. It has to be filled out. But what's really still missing is all the interstitial stuff on the ground. Funding for translational research, for preclinical work, pharmacotoxic and sort of pre-human animal data, giving academic investigators manufacturing capacity, giving technical assistance from the agency, how to do this to, clinicians and rare disease centers of excellence. That stuff isn't happening. The federal government could step in and do that. We have federal labs. We have a lot of smart people. Well, we have fewer smart people. we have that capacity. But I guarantee if you took those ingredients, put it in with plausible mechanism framework, which is directed at sponsors and investigators, academicians, I guarantee you could see a real renaissance in this area of very rare innovation. And it's very promising, but it requires you all, I think, actually to step up and provide dollars and authority to fill in those gaps.
Terrific, terrific. So we've got a couple minutes, and if there are some questions, we can field a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up the panel. Any questions from our attendees?
So I can tee you off a little bit more on plausible mechanisms,
You bet.
because I do think this is one of the things that I don't know if the baby KJ concept is that there's a CRISPR technology where you can kind of, you can manipulate the cells and actually, do a cure before someone gets older. And that same technology could be used again in a different disease state, but you're just kind of replacing the genetic, the improvements over and over again. And I think it's where the academic research institutions would like to be. I mean, you've got CHOP, you've got UC Berkeley with IGI, which is the Jennifer Downey's group. There are lots of groups working on it. It's very promising, but if you sit in those meetings, there's so much policy work that has to be done to get to what is a platform. And I would say 20 years ago, if you said we want a platform approach with FDA, they were like, oh my God, no way, no way. And now they're all in, which is great because the science has evolved. But I think what the challenge with the plausible mechanism, besides the name, I'm not sure I'm ever going to be a payer and I'm going to pay for something that's only plausible. So I tried to change the name on it, but it didn't work very well. But I think then you've got to say, all right, well, if you've got to have clarity on what is the FDA going to expect so that people can follow it over and over again and that can be consistently applied across products. Because you now have a lot of academic researchers who are looking at going, and then you also have the for-profit innovators that FDA would like to start working on this. And you've got to make sure that you've got consistent standards.
Well, there's a lot to digest there. Sorry, can you guys hear us? There's a lot to digest there in terms of preparing both the science as well as, then translating that into the marketplace or into the, real world where it's going to be utilized in a clinic or a physician's going to write that script at a rare disease center of excellence so that, the payers can make those decisions. And, I think both of you talked a lot about, making sure that there's certainty, that it's replicable, that, the payers can look at it and have confidence in the data and the understanding, and, plausible just kind of leads to a little bit of question there. So that, when they're paying for these technologies and products, the rare disease patient gets it on time. As many of you know, particularly with cell and gene therapy, sometimes there are windows of time. And I actually worked with a family in Colorado where their child was aging out of the time on the FDA-approved label while their state Medicaid was trying to decide if they were going to cover the medicine. Fortunately, a hospital stepped in and took the risk. And by that, I mean they took the risk of a multi-million-dollar therapy and dosed the child before she aged out of the label. And she is actually healthy and happy. I have been a Facebook friend with her mom since those very early days. And it's just amazing to me to see the difference. And, but those are the real world kind of results of understanding, having faith in the science, as well as the regulatory pathway, so that ultimately a state agency or a payer can make those decisions and that the patient can get that product on time. So with that, I'd like to thank our panel for this discussion. This has been wonderful, and we will move on to our next panel. Technology sometimes doesn't keep up with where we want to be. So, I would like to welcome our two panelists to this panel. I'm really excited to understand it because, we've been talking about why access issues and why understanding access is so important during drug development. Why the patient engagement as well as almost, engaging and preparing the payers for those kinds of discussions as well is so critical. But now we're going to talk about a program that has been very important over the last 30 years to making sure that those in need have, venues that they can go to for treatment. With that, we'll open up our panel on 340B. And so I'd like to first introduce Kalvin Pugh. Did I pronounce that right?
You got it.
Head of Legislative and Regulatory Advocacy at the Community Access National Network, or CANN. And by way of disclosure, I have been a board member of CANN for many years. It's an organization that I respect and has done really good work on patient access issues, looking at underlying payer issues, looking at the impact on patients. And Kalvin is an award-winning advocate and writer who's currently serves as the 340B policy director for CANN. He's a prominent voice in the debate over reform of the federal 340B drug pricing program, focusing on transparency, accountability, and ensuring the program prioritizes patient need. At CANN, he leads the organization's legislative and regulatory advocacy regarding the program, and his work involves legislative testimony, federal reform advocacy, and policy analysis. So, Kalvin, welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
We're very pleased to have you with us. And then I'd also like to introduce Jennifer Snow. Jennifer is the founder and managing director of Apteka, a health policy and reimbursement advisory firm specializing in pharmaceutical policy strategy. With over 20 years of experience, she's recognized as a subject matter expert on complex healthcare topics such as the Inflation Reduction Act, the Affordable Care Act, and biosimilar market dynamics. Jennifer's worked with RAAP for a number of years, exploring the implications of policy changes such as the IRA, Medicaid, and Medicare challenges, and more recently, prescription drug affordability boards that are being implemented at the state level. Prior to founding Apteka, Jennifer held several high-level leadership roles in healthcare and the life sciences. She served as the vice president of market economics and vice president of reimbursement policy insights at Exenda. She's worked at AstraZeneca as part of the executive branch advocacy team, and also worked at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to you both. So I'd like to turn it over to both of you. I know, Jennifer, you have some kind of big picture things that you want to cover first.
Yeah, I really would like to spend some time talking about what 340B is, because it's one of those words or one of those programs that you hear about and you kind of know about, and you're not, at least I should say that, because on last weekend I went for a walk with my husband, like we do every night after dinner. We walk the dog around the block and we talk about what we've got going on this week. And I mentioned I was coming here to do a 340B talk, and he reads all my stuff that I write, and he whispers it, which was weird. He's like, I don't understand 340B. And I'm like, okay, for one thing, why are you whispering? Are you afraid that, our neighbor's gonna come out of the house and be like, you don't know 340B? And the other thing is well, yeah, it's a confusing program and your job has nothing to do with 340B. So I'm like, it's okay. But I figured he's probably not the only one. So I thought I would level set with some basics about the program so that everybody, so if you know it, great. If not, it provides a nice foundation for what I think some of the issues that we want to talk about are. So I'm going to time travel back to 1990, because that is when this problem sort of started. We talk about unintended consequences a lot. And for those of you on the Hill, everybody does their best with, the legislation that comes out, but there's always these unintended consequences. And that's just the nature of I think, moving forward with any kind of big bill. But in 1990, Congress passed a law requiring drug manufacturers to give Medicaid the best price that they offered anybody in the commercial marketplace. Totally makes sense. Except manufacturers had been voluntarily giving discounts to community health centers and public hospitals. And so once those discounts had to be counted towards that best price, manufacturers understandably said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give those prices back to those, voluntarily give those prices, because now we're dragging down our whole market basket. And so Congress noticed, and 2 years later, created Section 340B of the Public Health Service Act to fix it, 8 pages long. Deal is straightforward. If you want your drugs covered by Medicaid and Medicare Part B, you agree to sell these. You agree to sell those at a heavily, you agree to sell at a discount to these covered entities. And in exchange, manufacturers, get Medicaid and Medicare access. That was the original bargain. Modest at best, 50 different covered entities, 8 pages long. And that's where we get interesting. Because those 8 pages are now governing a program that is about, maybe even a little over $100 billion worth of value in 2026. And that's, we're not comparing 1992 to 2026, we're comparing 2010 to 2026. In 2010, total purchases were 6.6 billion. Now, over 100 billion. And, it's the second largest drug program, only behind Medicare Part D. It represents, close to 10% of the entire US outpatient drug market. And the value of this is largely into specialty drugs. Specialty drugs count for 61% of 340B. Keytruda is the largest of the 340B purchases. It's about $8.16 billion. An HIV treatment is second at $4 billion. I mean, these are not we're not talking $5 generic blood pressure medicines. We're really talking about more expensive products. When we talk about the problems in 340B, the one thing I want to be very careful with, because I get LinkedIn, if I post something on 340B, I always get some federally qualified health center in Kansas who will be very angry, and they'll be like, well, I'm doing awesome, I'm doing my best in serving patients. And I want to be clear that not all covered entities are the same. When pharmaceutical manufacturers are, pharma or bio or any of the groups are angry about 340B, they're not angry at all of them. I really want to differentiate. There are kind of 3 different groups of 340B entities that I want to talk about. The first is the federal grantees. The program's working as intended for the most part. Could there be modifications to all this? Sure. But in general, federal grantees, so these are federally qualified health centers, the Ryan White HIV clinics, family planning clinics, black lung clinics. These are all still functioning closest to the original intent of the program. They are federally qualified health centers are legally required to pass savings to patients. They operate on a sliding fee schedule for those below 250% of the federal poverty line. The money doesn't sit on a balance sheet. It really goes directly back to the patient. So no one is arguing that these providers are in the wrong. The second group is the ACA, the Affordable Care Act expansion providers. So this group is those that were added because of the Affordable Care Act. They are critical access hospitals, sole community hospitals, rural referral centers, freestanding cancer centers. These are not where most of us would point. I mean, could there be, again, edits around the edges? Sure. But these are mostly rural, often the only hospital within a reasonable distance. 340B is often a general survival mechanism for these organizations, for these hospitals, not a revenue strategy. And they also face a restriction when it comes to orphan drugs, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. Third group is, I think, where we see most of the problems. And that is the large urban nonprofit hospitals. And these are also the academic medical centers. And I don't want to name them by name, but if I started to, you'd be like, yep, I know, you've heard of all of them. And these are a genuinely different situation when it comes to 340B. These hospitals are not required by law to pass along any savings. So the whole point is that they exist on spread. The product is purchased at a low price, and then they get reimbursed. And often because they're academic medical centers, they get reimbursed at a much higher rate than anybody else does in the market. They get reimbursed. That spread is where they make their money. None of that spread has to go back to patients. And often it doesn't. And that in itself wasn't necessarily a problem, kind of was, but it really became a problem in 2010, which is why, for those of us who've been working in this industry for a while, like, I mean, I don't think I even thought about 340B in grad school. I know I didn't. I probably didn't even know what it was. My first few years of working in policy, I had no idea what 340B was. I worked at Apteka Health, and I couldn't have told me. I would no idea. It was really, 2010, 2014, 2015, where I think all of a sudden it was like 340B. You needed a policy for it, and that's because originally, covered entities dispense 340B through their own in-house pharmacies. So you went to, suburban hospital for an ER visit or to visit your doctor who happened to be associated with it, and you would go downstairs in the lobby and you'd fill your prescription because it was easy, it was there, you didn't want to stop at CVS on your way home. No big deal. But what happened with the changes is that HRSA, the agency that administers the program, issued guidance allowing covered entities to use an unlimited number of outside pharmacies, and they did. So the intent was access. Let patients fill the prescription at their local pharmacy instead of having to go to that downstairs pharmacy in the basement of the hospital. I mean, it sounds good, except what it means is that every single pharmacy around you, like if you have I live in Bethesda and the Wildwood Center has a CVS. What's a contract pharmacy? Like, who goes there? What is it? What gets used? There, we went from fewer than 1,300 pharmacies to over 200,000 active pharmacies. So that's where you get that growth in the program from being, just 6.6 billion to over 100 billion. Because now, even though, for example, I went to the ER at GW a long time ago, like 15 years ago. Stupid little injury, like could have been handled by urgent care, like I was fine. But I had to get an antibiotic afterwards. And like now, GW can claim me as a patient. I went to GW once, 15 years ago, but like, am I now a patient of GW? And there's no definition of what a patient is, what the goal of the program is. So is the goal to provide that money back? Like, am I supposed to save money at the pharmacy? Is an uninsured patient supposed to save money at the pharmacy? And so what's happening is that if, let's say, I didn't have insurance and I went to the pharmacy and I paid $300 for a prescription, like just a random prescription that my primary care doctor, who has nothing to do with GW, prescribed, I could go to the pharmacy and pay $300 out of pocket. GW could claim me as a patient and make money on that script and save money on that script, and yet I would be paying $300 out of pocket. Like I don't even know that they claimed me as a patient, and we're seeing some of that. Like AbbVie just released a study that said, or a court released a court ruling that said that they had 3 hospitals in New York trying to claim credit for the same prescription. And like, that's really just happening. And so I wanted to flag that. I'm talking a long time, so sorry. So the patient benefit question, and Kalvin will be talking more about this. I mean, that's a central argument about the 340B debate. And the hospital side points to real programs. And if you talk to hospitals, they will absolutely say, like, we keep a credit card behind the desk so that if a patient comes up and says that they can't afford the medicine, like, we pay for it. And that absolutely happens. There are programs that are using the 340B benefit and using it well. Where no uninsured patient in a hospital in Georgia, no uninsured patient pays more than $5, or a rural hospital that runs the only outpatient oncology department in Adirondacks, because it includes a fund for patients to travel to it. But in general, what we see is that 340B hospitals actually provide less benefit to patients, to patients than non-340B hospitals as a percentage of revenue. And, there's no federal requirement that the money has to be shared. GAO audits confirm that many 340B hospitals don't offer discounted pricing to uninsured patients. And so, I mean, again, the main question is like, who is the patient? How do you define it? How do you define contract pharmacy, and are they related? And where does the data go? Because again, I think one of the big questions the pharmaceutical companies have is with this explosion of contract pharmacies, they don't even know, they're just kind of given a bill and told to pay it, and they don't even know how that money flows or where it's coming from. And they get like the 3 invoices for one patient, and it's only until they dig in that they can see it. The rare disease angle, and Mike, I'd love to hear more about kind of like how you guys are viewing, your concerns about it. But when the ACA expanded 340B eligibility in 2010, Congress made a deliberate choice. And it said critical access hospitals, rural referral centers, and freestanding cancer hospitals, that second group, cannot access 340B pricing on orphan designated drugs. It wasn't an oversight, it was a policy judgment. And the logic was that the Orphan Drug Act exists because developing treatments is genuinely hard for orphan drugs. And it's the reason, the patient population is small, the trials are difficult, the path to market is long. And manufacturers invest because they expect to make, eventually to make money on it. And, if you erode the pricing model through mandatory discounts, then eventually you erode the incentive to develop drugs in there. And so courts have interpreted the exclusion broadly. If a drug has orphan designations, the new entity cannot get the 340B price, full stop, even if the drug is being used for non-orphan conditions. And there's arguments that is too blunt, but, and that's a real tension, I think, for rural hospitals. But, the question I think I sit with at least is, if we collapse that exclusion, if we collapse the orphan drug pricing models, who absorbs the cost? It's not the hospital, it's not the insurer, it gets we get reduced innovation in the space. And I worry about that, and I worry about that a lot, I think, when it comes to most favored nation and PDABs and the other things that are floating around. I don't think that we are giving enough credit and enough incentive to rare disease. I see all of the things happening, and I appreciate them. I appreciate that drug pricing is high in the U.S., but I also think that we have come so far. It's been so amazing to watch some of the innovations we have, and I don't want to lose that in the United States. So I hope I've left you with a sense of where the current landscape is, because it's genuinely unsettled. 340B, we have a lot of states kind of lawsuits moving through the states protesting the contract law. We have federal courts acting on it. And we also have movement, and you'll hear about things about the rebate rule, whereas that would provide, because right now manufacturers provide the discount on the front end. It's a prospective discount. The question is, like, they sell the drug at a lower rate. The question is, what they want to say is move it to a retrospective discount, so that they wouldn't give the discount until after the drug is purchased with claims data. And so that's coming up there, and I'm happy to talk about those issues. But there is just 340B is a very interesting kind of area, and one that I think when you look at the growth in the program, it's just fascinating, and not where I think we intended to be with the 50 hospitals, 50 entities, to where we are today with over 200,000. I mean, that's just crazy. So,
It was hard to follow that, isn't it?
yeah, you've got the patient angle. Patients are where we should be focused.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the legislative intent of 340B, it is very clear. It's to provide more resources, to stretch those federal resources as far as possible to reach more patients and provide more eligible services. That's the legislative intent. And when you talk to a hospital, they stop at to stretch scarce federal resources.
Yeah.
I do all of my work both in the states and in all 50 states and then here in Congress. We need a federal fix, period. End of discussion. The states have taken it into their own hands to start expanding contract pharmacies to protect the rural hospitals or the FQHCs or the Rhineland programs, and they're not protecting anyone. I recently just sat down with the CEO of my first job in public health in an FQHC, because we were on opposite sides in the state of Missouri about whether there should be transparency and accountability brought to the program in the state of Missouri. And he called me, he said, "We're on opposite sides of a fight here, what's going on?" I said, "Well, let's sit down, let's talk about this." Turns out we're not.
Yeah, I'm like, you're not.
Because as an FQHC, they are required to provide evidence of what they did with the money. Same thing with state AIDS drug assistance programs. They have to account for every dime that they've spent and they have to invest all that money back into the program. The issue is coming up of the for-profit, obviously the hospitals are playing a major role in this, but your for-profit entities, your contract pharmacies, 340B is a budget line item on CVS's shareholder call. That's gross. The amount of money that they're taking through PBMs, through their third-party administrators, is actually suffocating federally qualified health centers and Ryan White programs. Because, as I was sitting with my former boss, he was saying that they're being murdered by those TPA fees that raise 20% every year, and it's in the contract. So why would you sign something like that? Well, when you talk about smaller providers, they have no contract leverage. So there's no way for them to not pay those fees. Do they have an in-house pharmacy? Yes. But if a patient has to take the bus all the way to Midtown, that's a trek to pick up a medication. How adherent are you going to be to your medications? If you need something vital, like something for a rare disease, you have to go all the way, and you very well may not feel like getting on a bus for 2 hours. This is to expand access and reach more eligible patients. And the states have taken it into their own hands. CANN released a policy paper in January about the conflicts that are arising between the potential legislation here in Congress and some of the rulemaking that's happening with several of the states and where those conflicts will arise, mostly supremacy, obviously. But we need a federal fix because these states are like running rampant and running rogue, and it's at the state level. They think it's good intention.
Mhm.
It's good intention. They hear from the hospital association, who's often part of the provider association, who the FQHCs are also a part of. And so when my former boss went to the State House to talk about transparency in 340B, the provider association called him and threatened him. There's so many big players in this thing that
There's
are
so much money.
extracting value from this program that could lower the cost of medications at the pharmacy counter for patients. But that's not what's happening. The 340B, I always tell folks, is my favorite 4-letter word. But this program is being taken hostage by pirates, healthcare pirates, by the PBMs, the TPAs, everybody else who's extracting value from this program that should be your boss's constituents. It should be passed along to them.
I was gonna say, there's 50 firms that specialize in what they call program optimization.
Yes.
You know, those who the entities that try to capture that third party.
Yeah, and if there are certain online publications that only talk about 340B, and I won't. But even on their sites, the advertisements for maximizing their patient benefit, or to maximizing their profit benefit from the program, is frankly foul. And at this point, like, you all have to step in because we have a real problem, and if we want patients, if we really care about bringing down the cost of medication, if we really care about providing more access, then we need to address. Because I always said this: the manufacturers, the drug manufacturers, people they've got a bad rap, right? They need a PR firm. They need a better PR firm. And patients want exactly the same thing. Patient wants access to medications that they need. Pharmaceutical companies want patients to have access to a medication. But every single person that comes along and adds in their $5, well, it's not $5, it's $5,000 they're throwing on that price tag. I am the example of what 340B looks like when it works. When I was diagnosed with HIV 10 years ago, the state ADAP program paid for my drugs. My drugs every month are $3,500. Who the hell can afford that? But because of the state ADAP program that covered the medication, I'm here. I'm not dead. So we need to do something.
So I wanted to come back because these are very powerful, both in terms of framing the value of the 340B program. Let's call it what it is. It's a very valuable program.
Absolutely.
But yet, taking those intentions and then bringing it or expanding it to the point where things break. And I want to go back to something that was mentioned earlier because during the Affordable Care Act, there was a debate around rare diseases, and I was in some of those rooms. because some of the companies that would be affected by the expansion had small population medicines. And that they were basically giving to 340B programs complex biologics for a penny. And any expansion in the program meant that those products went underwater and would no longer be available to patients. And I remember Congressman Waxman actually sitting with me and talking about it and looking at numbers with me and looking at products that would go away if there was a massive expansion of 340B and those penny-priced complex biologic orphan medicines actually disappeared from the marketplace. So I remember those conversations well. And, you know, that when you talk about the importance of both the program as well as the innovation, but also access to existing medications that could have been threatened by just a pricing decision or, you know, an expansion that didn't just, they wanted to do something very, very noble and very important to patients. But at the same time, there's an economic consequence. Absolutely. So, I mean, we talked a little bit about it. If you could summate what kinds of things could we do that would most affect that transparency, the targeting of resources, and the ability to be accountable in the program. What are some of the key guidances that you might point to that would be helpful here?
So the first thing I would do, if I could if I could do a non-controversial, let's say given, it's gonna be, whatever we do is gonna be controversial, right? Like,
Nothing.
okay, so what if we said, what are you not allowed to spend the $340 dollars on? Let's start there. Like, that seems like an easy, hey, you know what? Here's what you're not allowed to build a new employee fitness center. You're not allowed to spend it on a parking lot. You're not allowed to,
Buy the naming rights for a stadium.
or put an ad on the Super Bowl. You have to spend it, you cannot spend it here. I mean, that would be like a nice starting point, not my ending point, but starting point. I would like a better definition of what the intent of the program is and what a patient is.
Yeah.
Those seem like, they should be bipartisan issues. I mean, those are basic definitions to me that should be, easy reaches.
And I know it's very controversial here on the Hill, but the first step is the rebate model.
I love it.
That is going, that the comment period ends Monday. I know that a lot of your offices have heard, don't do this, stop them. But if hospitals are never held accountable for the amount of money that they're making off of this program, we'll just have more and more for-profit entities who are finding a way to extract value from this program.
Yeah.
We started with a few of them, and now CVS and Walgreens are running away with, with all the money.
Well, what if, it doesn't make sense to pay on a prospective basis anyway, or to not get a bill. It's like
Yeah.
if someone just came to you and was like, I need this much money from you, and you're a public, and you're like, well,
Yeah.
why would I give you, I need $50,000. Okay, well, why? I need it,
And that's
okay? But why? Can you give me a bill? Can you, no, you can't, okay.
essentially at this point the hospital's telling everyone, just trust us.
Yeah.
Well, you all work here. You know that doesn't work. Just trust us doesn't work.
Well, they're public organizations
Yes.
too, they can't just.
So, but if you look at 340B hospitals, they're charging way more in medical debt than a non-340B hospital. So not only are you not passing along the savings to a patient, you're sending them into collections.
Yeah.
And some of the most aggressive medical debt collections in the country are from 340B hospitals.
Correct.
You are putting people in poverty by not addressing this issue. The rebate model will be a great first step. Because at this point, as I was talking about the state age drug assistance programs, those are a rebate model and have been since the inception of 340B. They're doing fine. They have no problems accounting for what they are. And especially when we talk about a hospital system or a for-profit company who has more employees and more resources than the state's age drug assistance program. Or a FQAC, they have more resources and staff that they can certainly And I guarantee you, the third parties that they're hiring, like Apteka, they know what they're making. They just don't want you to tell. They just don't want to tell you.
So, we're looking at the current landscape, and I know both of you probably have looked at what the president's budget recommends for 27, which is moving the 340B program from HRSA over to CMS to try and increase accountability, data collection, transparency, et cetera. Could you share with us maybe some thoughts on, first, what you think about that, and two, what would your advice be to CMS as they look at onboarding that program into the center?
I'm like, to me, at least CMS has more resources and
More accountability, probably. I don't think the program needs to be moved until it's fixed. You can't take a broken clock and just set it in another room and it's gonna work. You need to fix it first. So I think the program does require some federal reform at this point to move it along. But I think we also are gonna see with the ruling from yesterday, the second ruling in favor of stopping a state's pharmacy contract expansion. I mean, I think we'll end up at Supreme Court before long.
you're across the street.
They're very close, aren't they? Another question that I had, and particularly at the state level, we're looking at increased interest in price controls. And of course, in the rare disease community, we work with the blood disorders organizations. We work with other important patient groups that need, as we talked about, those 340B resources provide funding for clinics, exams, for tests, transportation, getting patients into care. And yet with some of the changes going on, we see those kind of critical organizations being squeezed. Could you talk to us a little bit about how we could protect those types of organizations and enhance access? And what would your recommendations be there for that?
I mean, I think any entity or organization that's going to be a case by case basis. But if the real issue at this point is the contract pharmacies and then squeezing the money out of them. And where I used to work, they use 340B for dental vans to go into the inner city where they don't have dentists. But they can't do that anymore because Walgreens and CVS has taken all the money. And I think addressing that, I think we need, when we're talking about contract pharmacies, there should be a distance. Shouldn't get 340B medication sent to me from Honolulu, right? I'd love to go pick up my meds in Honolulu. Like, what a delight. But that doesn't make sense. And that's because of PBM's ruling, like, that you have to get your meds from a mail order pharmacy. I think expanding access means getting those resources back into the programs and the organizations that need it to survive, because we are in a increasingly complex healthcare landscape, and we need those vital organizations who are in communities who are helping save lives.
Well, we'd like to turn it over to all of you again, if you have any questions for the panelists. That would be the time. Any questions?
And I'll just say, I can give any of you my card. I eat, sleep, breathe, and the reason I drink is 340B. So I'm happy to be a resource to your offices. If it's 340B, that's me.
And we will be taking you up on it at RAAP as well. This is an important issue, particularly as we talk about the rare disease treatment model, and patients often travel quite a distance to go to centers of excellence. And centers of excellence, accessing 340B, making sure that there are services for patients. Again, being able to go across state lines, being able to make sure that that care is coordinated, whether it's with Medicaid or the commercial payer. There's a lot of issues that we need to make sure get sorted out,
Absolutely.
so that that patient has access to the care that they need. And so rare disease patients, kind of take a different, you really have to think a little bit differently about the way they're accessing care. And so 340B is really important at RAAP. And we would love to follow up with all of you on that as well. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists. This has been a wonderful panel, and thank all of you for participating with us. The Rare Access Action Project is really, as I had said at the front end, focused on making sure that patients have access to both care and treatments for the right time in their patient journey. And sometimes that means that we have to have a flexibility and an understanding of the needs for rare patients. And so, again, thank you for taking time with us today. And with that, we'll adjourn. There are lunches in the back, so please feel free to grab something to eat, and we look forward to catching up with you further on this. Thank you.